Just over a week ago, Prime Minister Heath called for a national election in Great Britain. The purpose was to stabilize or perhaps reinforce his mandate. The direct purpose of his mandate in the present emergency is to ratify his resistance to the coal miners' union, which has demanded a one-third pay increase. Mr. Heath's position has been that this would only set off another inflationary spiral, without saying exactly what they would do if brought into power. Mr. Wilson and the Labour Party are blaming the breakdown in negotiations on the inept leadership of the Conservatives. There are two very distinguished journalists here to discuss the British crisis. Anthony Lejeune, a graduate of Balliol College in Oxford, who was editor of Time and Tide, the now defunct conservative English weekly. He is now London editor for National Review. He is a novelist and has worked as a correspondent for the Daily Express and writes widely. Mr. Bernard Levin is a graduate of London University and has spent all of his working life as a journalist, a theater critic, and doing radio and television work. He is a columnist for the London Times, whence his thunderbolts are directed at the expense of people, parties, and institutions of every political coloration. I'd like to begin by asking Mr. Lejeune why it is that Mr. Heath, having at this moment all the power he needs, should sound as though he needed more power in order to cope with the emergency.
Well, I think there are two levels always at which a question like that must be answered. The ostensible level, which to some extent, the way his own mind has worked, I think, is he's in a corner. He leant over backwards to appease the miners far too much, as many of us think. They said nothing but money on the table. If he allowed them money on the table, in addition to the 16.5%, which was already to be allowed them under his incomes policy, he wouldn't have been able to hold his own followers because they regard the present economic crisis as having had its origins in the surrender to the coal miners' strike 2 years ago, and they are absolutely determined that the same thing shouldn't happen again, because they think if it does, they see no future for any form of economic policy under this government. It would be disastrous. Therefore, Heath has only two things he can do. He can either actually surrender to the coal miners, which, as I say, I think would be politically suicidal, or he's got to fight them. If he fights them without going to the country, it means a long and bitter struggle with appalling economic results if you have a very prolonged miners' strike. And he believes, rightly or wrongly, that by securing a new mandate, he would be able to take, on the one hand, tougher measures, and on the other hand, that the miners, knowing that by persisting they wouldn't get a Labour government, would be more willing to compromise. Whether this is right or not remains to be seen. On the other hand, of course, I do think you have to say the real reason, the best reason for going, is that the Conservatives' chance of winning an election now is a good deal better, probably, than it would be at any time in the next 18 months, which is as long as he's got, because the further inflation, which is already in the pipeline, is bound to come out in the form of price increases of anything up to 15% in the coming year. And if first you had a long, bitter coal strike with electricity cuts and every other sort of disaster, and then you had 15% price rises, this is not a good platform to fight on, so it's probably better to fight now.
Mr. Levin, let me ask you this. In America, we have a very considerable, or at least I do, ignorance of really the structural nature of the contest. We have always assumed that it's sort of axiomatic that one should not be permitted to strike in a critical industry, and in fact, industries that are actually owned, as the coal miners is owned by England, owned by the people, are never permitted to strike. This doesn't mean that we don't have illegal strikes, but at least we know they're illegal. Now, as I understand it, the coal miners' strike is perfectly legal under English law. What is it that Heath is going to the people to permit him to do?
I don't think it can be answered in those terms. I don't think anything specific in those terms is going to come out of the election of any considerable importance. There are going to be a few minor adjustments, as for instance the pledge in the last few days by Heath that if the Conservatives win, they're going to alter the law on social security benefits for strikers' families, so that although the strikers' families will continue to get their social security benefits, so they won't literally go hungry or be thrown out of their houses or anything, the unions will have to contribute some of that money. This seems to me a reasonable proposition. But it's only at that level that the law will in fact be changed in the aftermath of a Conservative victory. What then can he do in the way of strengthening himself in these fields? The answer is very little, except there is one thing we ought to consider. Unfortunately, it will work less with the miners than with almost any other group of workers in essential trades. And that's the psychological effect of a demonstration by the country that it is behind the government in this contest. I think we are in, if the Conservatives win, for a long and bitter strike by the miners. I don't think they're going to go back on the morrow of the polls merely because the country has demonstrated that they're behind the government. But at any rate, the country, having committed itself in that fashion by its votes, will, I'm then quite certain, also commit itself to suffering whatever hardships are involved, and they will be considerable, I'm certain, if the strike goes on for any length of time. Also, they will show that they're willing to do that. And it is that, I think, that Heath is banking on, that he once, with that mandate under his belt, he can ask the country to face the inevitable decline, the unemployment, the cold, the cuts in lights and the rest of it, the dislocation that will take place if the strike goes on for a long time. It will also, to some extent, weaken the miners' resolve to go on, but the miners are much tougher than most groups of workers, and they're much more cohesive. They're all in small areas, for instance. They're not scattered throughout the whole country. It's going to be a very difficult one. It's a pity, a lot of people are saying, and I agree with them, it's a pity that it had to be the miners who proved to be the test case for whether we held the line against inflation or whether inflationary wage increases or whether we didn't. There were other groups of workers who don't, for instance, have the very widespread popular sympathy that miners do in Britain. But that's it. The cards have got to be played where they fell.
Well, does either of you share my misgivings about a civil situation which needs to be resolved by pitting the will of the majority through a plebiscite rather than through legislation to tame a minority that seeks an inordinate leverage? It seems to me plain that a civilized society ought not permit any segment to paralyze the entire nation, and that under the circumstances, correct legislation would say, for instance, that not more than 10% of the mining industry can strike simultaneously. Is there any interest in reform of this character induced by this strike?
No, and there can't be, I think, for the
Tell
simple
me
practical
why.
reasons. There are 250,000 miners, roughly.
Yeah.
Supposing you passed legislation which made strikes, say in the present circumstances, illegal. The present circumstances then arose again and the 250,000 miners came out on strike. Where do you get a jail 250,000 people large? I mean, you can't do it.
Well, of course.
And once more, it won't get the coal dug out.
You don't jail them, of course, but we had a strike of this character 35 years ago in America, and the court imposed, I think it was $50 per day fine in John L. Lewis, rather than see the whole of the treasury of the coal miners depleted, in fact capitulated. But in America we have the rather curious notion that you can't strike against the government, so that our last offense is to seize the industry. It then becomes, it is then operated by the government, and the strike therefore becomes illegal. You observe no such distinction, do you?
Well, when we see, after all, the mines are already owned by the state.
That's what I say.
Yeah, what can we do?
There has never been a law, therefore, that you cannot strike
There were
against.
during the Second World War, there were such laws, and there was, in fact, a miners' strike, though only one area, one minefield area, during the Second World War. And the miners' leaders were prosecuted under the wartime emergency legislation and convicted.
For treason or for...
No, it wasn't serious that. It was a specific offence, striking against such and such regulations.
Then the government had let him out through the back door.
Yeah. In fact, it didn't work. The coal didn't get dug out of the ground.
But may I, first, a couple of things I want to say. Might I ask first, am I wrong in thinking you had a transport strike in New York which was illegal in just this way?
Oh, We've had several. We had transport strikes that were illegal. We had teachers' strikes that were illegal. We had garbagemen strikes that were illegal.
Didn't do a bit of good, did it?
No, it didn't do a bit of good for various reasons. Most of them, I think, that the entity against which they struck was an individual state rather than the federal government, whose clout is, of course, much more considerable. Yeah. You may remember that at one point Truman threatened to draft the railroad people who struck Senator Taft.
As the French do, of course, sometimes.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And as President Mobutu did with the students in Congo.
That's right, that's right. But it distresses me a little bit that even if you survive, as of course you will, this crisis, it should have been adjudicated on the basis of such massive movements of so many of your men, the whole country engaged in a strike against the whole of the coal mining industry. This breaks down the rather delicate pattern of a slightly atomized society in which no one unit is in a position to do impossible
yeah, but then
damage.
don't forget, it will also have, I hope it will have, and certainly it is intended to have, an ongoing effect as well. So that when the miners' strike is settled, the next group of essential workers who want to strike for a pay rise well outside the statutory limits laid down will be the less inclined to do so and the more inclined to settle under the legislation.
If it turns out to have been a costly strike.
If it turns out to be a costly strike, if it turns out the Conservatives win the election, that's
Yeah.
the first thing that's going to have to happen if any of this is going to take place at all, and
Yeah.
they may well lose it.
Yeah, I had a small play with what Bernard said a minute ago, that of course it was illegal to strike in such a way that the electricity or gas supplies were cut off. And the police also, after the police strike of, I think, 1919, accepted that they would never strike again. That there is a certain feeling in this country that essential services might perhaps have contracts of that sort. I would like to think we might get into a position where, in fact, just that sort of contract was attached to essential services. But the other thing I think...
Well, would you consider coal essential service?
Well, it probably is at the moment, and of course it'll cease to be. I mean, you would have to argue industry by industry. Mm-hmm. But I was going to say that the nature of the clash, of course, must be understood in that Heath did not want, and I do not want, to have a statutory incomes policy at all. Of course we don't want to force minorities to settle by the exercise of law. I don't want
what
to do that.
What we call wage and price
control. I
control.
want free economy. Yeah. But because Heath was, for reasons we could discuss, compelled to bring in an incomes policy, he's been landed in a confrontation that he didn't want. Once you get into that position, then of course you're inevitably going to get the government against a minority.
Because there's another problem there with the mines, which would not exist in, say, the engineering industry, is that when it is a state-owned industry, there is a feeling among the striking workforce that there's no question, as there might be with the private industry, of ruining the firm who is employing you because it's the state. And the state can pay you as much as it decides it has to, or will, or is willing to, merely by printing the stuff. Right. That, after all, is on the whole what has happened, so they're right in that sense.
Absolutely.
If it was a firm, an engineering firm, that was not state-owned and that would literally go bust if it paid the wage, then you might get a different kind of flexibility in negotiations. But there has been a tendency with the nationalised industries, although it makes no sense because the fight against inflation, it doesn't matter whether the inflation is taking place in the public sector or the private sector. If it's inflationary, is the same. Nonetheless, there is this feeling of extra intransigence because they say, in effect, well, what's the matter? The government can pay. Government's not going to go bust.
As Bernard says, I mean, the history of these things suggests that they're dead right in this respect. It's very curious, the same people who demand nationalisation in order that an industry should reflect national policy should strongly object when their industry is actually used to reflect national policy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, has there been any deflation in the kind of superstitious faith in nationalized industries as a result of an experience that seems to single out nationalized industries for most problems?
Not, I think, among those who have this superstition. I mean, superstition is by definition not susceptible of rational functioning.
I think one thing has happened. We have learned, those of us who needed to learn it, which wasn't everybody by any means, we have learned over the years that one thing that was hoped for, expected, and indeed promised of nationalization has not taken place, which is that labor relations
industrial serenity
would be better.
Yeah.
They haven't been better. They haven't been any worse, really. They've been more spectacular in some cases when they've broken down. They haven't really been worse, but they certainly haven't been better. That has at any rate gone by the boards.
So they don't talk about industrial democracy much more.
They talk about it, but nobody says that the act of nationalisation will bring it about.
No, by industrial democracy now they mean something different.
Right.
So worker participation,
Right.
two-tier boards, and that whole thing. Yeah.
I see. Well, now, in the event that the country mandates the Conservative government to oppose this strike, what, you spoke a moment ago about the government obviously can't put 250,000 people in jail, nor does it want to. What does it do towards sympathetic strikers in other industries? For instance, since you got to get coal from somewhere and you start importing it, suppose the people refuse to offload the coal as a gesture of labor solidarity. What then happens? Is that illegal?
It's not illegal, but there is a civil remedy. Those who suffer from such a strike, sympathetic strikes,
Which would be the government in this case.
which would be the government, that can take the union to court now under the Industrial Relations Act and can get damages against the union's funds, the point you were making earlier.
What if it's
It probably wouldn't be the government, of course. It would be the haulier firms and things like that.
In that case, it would be individual firms, but they can take the union which is causing the strike to court and get civil damages.
But of course they wouldn't. What you'd have is a general strike
practically.
and the normal political situation when you've got a general strike.
Well, now, presumably there won't be a general strike, or might you have simultaneously a Conservative victory and a general strike?
Yes, quite easily.
I think not. I think it's possible. I don't think in practice it will happen. I think we cannot forget the enormous effect of a Conservative victory, particularly a substantial Conservative victory.
How would you define a substantial one?
I think
10%,
an extra
5%?
an extra
seats?
50 seats, 70 seats, which are quite on the cards, putting the majority in a House of Commons of 635 up to about 100, say. If it's anything of that order of magnitude at all, and it may well be, because don't forget in our system it doesn't require much of a shift to produce a much magnified effect in seats in the House of Commons. If you get an election result of that kind, I think the effect will be very widespread. It will be weakest, alas, on the minors, but I think elsewhere very strong, because don't forget, a lot of the votes that will put Heath in with a majority of that kind will have come from trade unionists up and down the country, not to mention trade unionists' wives. A lot of those votes will come and will have to come. You just add up the numbers. There aren't enough votes elsewhere without a substantial contribution from the organised working class. If that contribution is given, it will in itself indicate a great deal about the political attitudes. And I therefore think that anybody who then tries to spread the miners' strike into anything like a general strike, and there will be people trying to do so, you may be sure, will be on a much, much weaker game.
Yes, I agree, actually. There could easily be a general strike, but I agree with Bernard. I don't think there will be.
Well, now, do you have any laws at all against secondary boycotts or sympathetic picketing, that kind of thing?
Yes, the Industrial Relations Act, again, gives a civil remedy.
This is one that passed,
one. That's
or the one that was drafted?
The one that was passed. It gives...
But only a civil remedy? You can't go to a court and get relief?
You go to court and get an injunction.
You can.
Then a breach of an injunction is, of course, contempt of court,
Right.
which is a separate and ancient remedy, always, of course. I suspect myself, though there's nothing in detail in the Conservative manifesto about this, that there would be some tightening up of that in a redrafting of the Industrial Relations Act. Though it's interesting that Heath is being very conciliatory about that. He's saying that we will amend the Industrial Relations Act, and clearly he's going to tighten it up in some areas, possibly this one, and relax it in others. I'm sure there will be concessions offered by...
It'll be sort of custom-made depending on the response.
I think so. I would guess so, certainly.
Yeah. Well, now, you have, of course, the advantage in your country, if you like, certainly an advantage in a situation like this, of being able to get instant legislation, can't you? You can, on Monday, facing a particular crisis, draft legislation and pass it on Wednesday, right?
Yes.
Now, can the House of Lords at this stage stand in the way of that?
It can, but it's very, very unlikely. The House of Lords at the moment can only, in any case, delay any legislation at all by a maximum of 9 months.
Well, it's a
and
long time.
And money legislation, any legislation involving the public money, only 1 month. Now, I agree, that can be a long time in a critical situation. In practice, the House of Lords has not, in fact, delayed any legislation at all
It
for
stands
a long
aside.
time. In any major a controversial political legislation for which the government of the day has the political mandate, I think you will never again see the House of Lords obstructing it at all. They will debate it, no doubt very carefully, but will not in fact seek to use their existing constitutional powers to delay it.
Well, let me ask you this, Mr. Lejeune, on the basis of how you've seen these things happen before. Will people who are questioning Mr. Heath in the next few days, will they ask him to reply specifically to the question, what will he do if A, B, C, or D? Or is it simply assumed that those questions are better left unasked?
You've also had experience of these things. You know exactly what will happen. Of course they'll ask him, and of course he'll say, I don't answer hypothetical questions.
Mind you...
Why shouldn't he answer a hypothetical
Very
question?
good question, but I've yet to hear a politician who doesn't produce this silly answer.
You agree?
I entirely agree. No politician is going to be tied down in present
And is not
circumstances
expected to?
And is not seriously expected. His opponent always makes much of it and says, you see, he was asked this perfectly clear question, what will you do in the following circumstances? And he ducked it. How can you vote for a man like that? Since the politician making that accusation, the following night is going to be doing exactly the same thing himself. It doesn't cut very much ice. But remember one thing. Heath has already promised in advance that a new form of pay-determining body, a relativities board, will be set up, and the miners will be able to take their case there. And it's quite clear, without Heath actually saying so, and without the board actually yet being constituted, that the first thing the board is going to do is to agree that there'll be some extra for the miners, on the basis of the report the pay board brought out only a few weeks ago, that there should be some way of determining a kind of social relativities over and above the play of the market or what there is in the kitty or the state of the inflationary pressure in the economy. That's going to happen. It's going to happen very quickly. And it may be that the miners will then settle for a small increase over and above what they've already been offered.
It would be sort of face-saving.
It would be face-saving all round, with one important advantage for the government, which is that the charge that will then be levelled at them, why couldn't you do this before the election? Why did you have to go through all this and a strike as well? They can then say, we offered it, as indeed they did. We said, we will set up this relativities board now if you'll call off the strike.
Yes, tactically, I think this is quite right. Philosophically, I think it's appalling. I think the relativities board is a new supreme nonsense which is going to be around our neck like an albatross for years.
Yeah.
But it is quite a convenient tactical way of getting out of this particular jam.
Yes, yes. Well, let me, you use Social Security in not exactly the same way that we do. Social Security is something that we get, when you're 65 years old, whatever. So that people who are, say, 35 years old don't draw down Social Security in America, though there are different reliefs of different kinds. Are you familiar enough with the figures to tell us what percentage of the income that now goes to a striking miner would cease to go to him if Mr. Heath's proposals were enacted into law?
Oh, it doesn't work like that. You see, at the moment, I was using the term social security in the specific British sense, which is, what it means is money which is paid by the state to people with no other source of income or an income grossly inadequate for basic needs.
Even if they're striking?
Even striking. Now, it does not go to a striker. A striker does not himself draw any of that, but the striker's family, if he has a family, does. His wife and children, on a graduated scale, do get enough to keep the family going.
That's kind of a quaint circumlocution, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah,
obviously he's going to
a
give
little
to his
quaint.
family.
A little quaint. And of course, a single miner with no family, he can get... the point of it is that nobody should be allowed to starve or indeed go seriously hungry or anything like that, or freeze to death or be thrown onto the streets because of strike action they are not themselves taking. Now, the wife and family may be entirely in support of the striker, but nonetheless, they should not suffer. That is the law. And what is more, it's outright. There is no way of qualifying that at all. I myself agree with that, and I think it's right. I don't think we should play cat and mouse in that fashion. Some countries have a system whereby it is a loan and has to be repaid after the strike is over, when the man's earning again. I'm not sure I agree with that either. I don't think that, the burden of debt among the poor is one of the worst problems societies like ours suffer, continuing debt. But I do think the government's suggestion that the union should be compelled to contribute is a very reasonable one, and I hope it will be enacted if the government wins.
Yes, the scale, well, just to give you an indication, they get their rent paid entirely if they can't pay otherwise, irrespective of the size of the mansion in which they live. In fact, most coal miners don't pay much rent because they live in houses provided virtually free by the coal board. And a miner with 2 children, I think he'd get about 19, 20 pounds a week, wouldn't he?
I think less. I think less. And what is more, it isn't. I mean, you mustn't think that there's any kind of luxury involved here, because they first have to exhaust all their resources that they already have. Any money they may have in a bank account, for instance, that has got to go first before they can get anything. So
it does?
Yeah.
You mean that they have to prove that
real want,
that they have exhausted their resources?
That's right. They have real want right now.
Well, so then presumably most of the striking coal miners, as of this moment, are not yet getting it.
Not
subsidies.
yet, no, I'm sure.
Except from the union.
Well, I slightly question this, because I think if the coal miner has 500 quid in his post office savings bank and he doesn't fork it out, his wife can still claim her social security. Don't think he can get out of here.
I'm not sure about that.
No, we're not sure.
The principle may well be, and I suppose it would logically be, that those to whom the benefits will go, that is the wife and children, not the striker himself, may be considered, and perhaps logically and rightly should be considered separately. Their resources are nil, therefore they get money. If the miner himself has money in the bank or the post office account, well, then it shouldn't be taken first. I think that's probably so. I'm not quite certain what the law is on that.
Well, now this has become this has become a very at an early moment, a very bitter contest, has it not, between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. The Labour Party insisting that there ought to be no suspension of benefits of any kind. I'm correct?
Yeah.
Yes, it's very difficult for the Labour Party to do much with that, because if the government was saying, we will stop paying the benefits and your wives and children can starve if you don't go back to work, it will be a very strong card for the Labour Party to play. The government is saying the unions will have to help support their striking members and their striking members' families. It's much more difficult to mount a really emotive campaign on that. You see, after all, what happened until this new law, which was 1966, I may say, until these new provisions were enacted, was that the unions paid strike pay to their members. Not very much, but a regular small sum per week.
And since their resources were finite, it meant that
a very long strike.
Yeah.
Some unions, of course, are very wealthy bodies indeed in Britain.
And also they get contributions from other unions, right?
And of course, also they got help from other unions. But of course, since then, unions have simply stopped paying strike pay entirely. Why should they pay if the state will pay?
One should say, I think the public opinion polls, for what they're worth, show overwhelming support for the government on this particular issue. So I don't think it has much mileage for the Labour Party.
I think they have played it tactically very well in making it this form, the unions to contribute, rather than the individuals to be allowed to go hungry.
Yes, yes. Although it isn't obvious to me what the shortfall is. If money is being paid for rent, for health services, for schools, for food, what is it that is actually? How do you describe the then privation?
Oh, I think that technically, I speak subject to Bernard's correction, the idea is that it will be assumed that the unions are paying £5 a week or something in strike pay, and that will be knocked off in advance. So if the union doesn't, they're £5 down, and of course they'll make the union pay it.
That's one possibility that's been canvassed. The government hasn't been specific on this. One possibility. And the other is that they should simply distrain upon the union when the strike's over for a certain amount, maybe a proportion of what the benefits have come to, or a contribution per striker per week, something of that kind. I don't think myself that this is, though there was an understandably very angry reaction from the Labour Party, I don't myself think this is going to play an enormous part in the campaign, and insofar as it does, I rather suspect it will play the part of helping the Conservatives rather than the Labour Party.
And you agree?
I agree, yes.
Yeah. Of course, it was rather deftly, I thought rather deftly turned by Heath when he said, in effect, that people oughtn't to pay extra as a result of being deprived of coal for the people who deprive them of the coal.
I mean, that is a good card to play, because after all, social benefits, payments of this kind come out of revenue, and that comes out of taxation, so the country is paying for it. And I think it's, to remind the country of that fact can do no harm.
Yeah. And it enables the strike to be maintained indefinitely, financially, of course.
Yeah. Well, now, what mechanism survives in England for suggesting what the wage ought to be for a coal miner?
There's a national negotiation. You see, we're in a difficult position here because there is a national coal board, which is an autonomous body which runs the mines. But everybody knows that really, in the last resort, it is not an autonomous body, and the government finally directs its policy on such things as wages and prices. And indeed, there have been many movements, Tony here will agree with this, I don't, that the coal board should be freed to be like any other industry, to charge what it likes for its products and to pay what it need to its workers, and to negotiate just like any other firm has to. This is not so. Because the price of coal is subject to government regulation, and incidentally that was true before the new legislation of control on prices and incomes alike, therefore wage negotiations have to be done also with the government, with their one eye over their shoulder at the government. And so when the unions and the wage board and the coal board go into negotiation, which they do every year or every 2 years or whatever it is, a general review automatically, apart from any special demands made by the miners, they do it within that framework. It's a hell of a problem, because all such awards in the end are arbitrary.
What's missing is a free market mechanism.
Well, I was going to say, and the price of coal, of course, has been artificial ever since the war. It was highly subsidized for a long while, mainly by excluding foreign coal, or taxing foreign coal, and thereby keeping the price of English coal down beyond what it should be. And now, of course, the situation looks like being reversed. We no longer have to keep the mines open. We want to use them more for a while, though possibly not for very long. But of course, in the last resort, however you rig the market, the question is whether you can get enough coal miners or not. There is a little dispute, oddly enough, about whether coal miners have been leaving the mines in droves or whether they've been coming back in droves. The real answer is that there is a shortage of miners, but not much of a shortage. Not as much of a shortage as there is in a lot of other trades. Coal miners don't really mind mining coal as much as middle-class intellectuals think they do.
Well, this is, of course, a problem that we experience in America, and the problem of how do you decide, other than by being arbitrary, what ought to be paid to somebody who works for a national or nationalized or municipalized industry. And the most ingenious suggestion of a scientific kind has been made by Professor Yale Rosen of the University of Chicago, which is that a measurement ought to be taken of the number of people who leave that particular industry in the course of a year, and that adjustments ought to be made with reference to that. That suggests the allure, the relative allure of bus driving or school teaching or civil service or whatever. Is there any effort by the coal board to to decide, with reference to the influx of people who want to be coal miners or the desertion of the mines, what the right price is?
Well, of course, having an incomes policy in any sense prevents you doing this, or at least it builds in a lag. You can't respond to a shortage of people as quickly as you should. And almost all what you call scientific methods of determining relative wages seem to me to be attempts to predict the shortage a little before it becomes obvious.
Well, it can be scientific and empirical, and Rosen's formula is highly empirical.
Yeah.
If let's say the coal miners lose people at the rate of 10% per year, and the electrical workers lose at the rate of 5% per year, this would suggest that either the coal miners aren't getting as much as they ought to get, or that the work is itself so unpleasant that you need to put a premium.
But this is just a rather complicated way of saying that you've got to up your wages when you're not getting enough chaps, isn't it?
Yes, but normally that transaction is effected on the marketplace. But if you have an administrative unit, as you do in England, then it's got to be transacted through it. And the question is, how does it do so intelligently? Either it does so politically, or it does so with some reference to a market mechanism.
Well, I think that the Relativities Board suggested that we're going to have now, if the Conservatives win, will be doing something not far from this. And I'm sure that the number of people, I don't think they will do it, so they may do, for all I know, on a straightforward arithmetical basis based on the number of people leaving an industry. But I'm sure that's something they will obviously take into account, because you see, one of the things we've been hearing from the miners' side of the dispute is that they are angry, and understandably angry, at some of the enormously higher wages than theirs being drawn by people doing jobs very, very much less not skilled jobs, but jobs very much less demanding and unpleasant than the miners. And they went so far as to say that why should we take these wages for mining when miners who have left the pits, our own mates, left the pits recently and go working on building sites and are getting twice the money that we are? Well, the answer to that is there is no direction labour. Nobody is compelled to remain a miner. If one miner can go and do that, so can another miner. To which their answer is there is more to the money in the mines. For us, there is this whole mining community feeling, which is very strong indeed still in Britain. But the fact is that that's the kind of thing we're going to get. You can never get a system, obviously, in which all these anomalies are straightened out. But I think that a relativities board is perhaps the way to take a step towards straightening out the worst of them and seeing that there are certain industries whose workers have fallen further behind than is socially acceptable. Economically acceptable, they can't fall further behind because, in fact, that is a reflection ultimately of the need for coal, the need for miners, the need for mines. But socially, yes, I think that there's a certain degree of feeling that there are some trades which are too poorly paid for their contribution to the nation, yes, and that ought to be somehow adjusted.
You could, of course, pay a premium for certain trades if you wanted to. Nurses is the universally popular example. Though I never understand why, if you want to pay nurses more, you can't have a nurses more pay fund to which everybody contributes every week if they feel that way inclined. But what really worries me about this whole business is that what miners, in quotes, ought to be paid is being tackled simultaneously on two incompatible levels. One, what it is fair they should be paid on the ground it's nasty to mine coal. On the other hand, what they need to be paid on the ground we need coal. These are literally incompatible principles.
Right. They can yield completely different answers.
And what worries me is that Mr. Heath is now going all out for what he calls fairness, and the Relativities Board will be an instrument that is supposed to adjudicate fairly. Once you open that box, precisely, then everybody is going to think he is unfairly treated. He's going to think that the government knows how to treat him fairly and is meanly refusing to do so. Very dangerous situation to get into.
Let me just change the subject and ask you briefly before we turn to the panel, if you'd speculate a little bit about one or two things. One is the rather unexpected move of Enoch Powell. How do you interpret his decision not to run again?
I think Tony ought to speak first on that one because he's an old Powellite from top to bottom, and I'm not.
I'm not Powell from top to bottom.
From side to
side, yes. Two things only I'd say about that. One, I think that Powell could not have run on a Heath election platform. It would have been totally inconsistent with everything he said. And since intellectual honesty is his main banner, Bernard may not believe it, but it is his main banner, it would have been quite illogical for him to run on this platform.
It seems to me, I remember in 1970 he wrote to his constituents and said that he thought very poorly of him and had slandered him, so on and so forth, but that they should nevertheless vote for the Conservative ticket because the alternative was horrible. Why couldn't he do the same thing?
Well, because, again, he's made such very specific statements about this specific problem, and this election is so much a one-issue election that for him to stand on that platform would have been more inconsistent than it has been in the past. But the other thing I wanted just to say about Enoch Powell, which I'm quite sure is right, people are always seeking to read into his actions some cunning plan which he intends shall land him in Downing Street. I think this is absolutely wrong. I think that some years ago he realised that as long as Heath remained leader of the Conservative Party, nothing he did would get him back into the cabinet. If Heath ceases to be leader of the Conservative Party, the situation is then so fluid that it's unpredictable. I think he decided at that point that there was no games plan that would be useful to him. Therefore, the sensible thing was to say what he thought and just carry on to see what happened. That, I think, is what he's done ever since and what he's still doing.
Is this make sense to you?
That's the standard Powellite reply, but it's nonsense from beginning to end. The first half is nonsense in the most obvious and demonstrable way. There's nothing whatever to stop Powell standing for Parliament in his own constituency as Enoch Powell, not as member of the Conservative Party or a supporter of Mr. Heath's. His constituents, like the rest of the nation, know what he thinks of Heath's economic policies. He thinks they're mad, dangerous rubbish. That's what he believes, and he goes on saying it day and night. Why could he not simply stand, I am Enoch Powell, I think this government's policies are ruinous and crazy, if you will put me in Parliament, I'm going to go on saying that, and you need not expect me to say anything else. Now, choose me or reject me as you wish. There was nothing
Would that
whatever
get
to
in the
stop
way
him
of his
doing it.
formal sponsorship by the Conservative Union?
Yes, but then he's in an even better position, because if the Conservatives dared to run an official Conservative Party candidate against Enoch in his own fortress, Wolverhampton, the Conservative Party candidate would have been smashed to fragments.
Yes, but then he is...
Now, why shouldn't he do that?
I'll tell you exactly why he shouldn't do it. Because he is fundamentally a Conservative Party politician. If he is ever to have any future, it must be within the Conservative Party. If he once runs against a Conservative Party candidate, he has no future.
He wouldn't need to run against a Conservative Party candidate. All he would need to do is say, I am the candidate, I've been readopted by the local association, and in the British party system, it's the local association that adopts the candidate, not the central.
They can't be overruled.
They can be overruled, but they can only in very special circumstances, and again, the Conservative Party wouldn't have dared to do it. After all, this is what we had in 1970. Powell was in effect campaigning against his party's leadership and against his party's policies. So I think that this is nonsense. I do not, I must say, understand what Powell is after. One thing I'm quite certain of is, first, is that the first half of Tony's answer was nonsense, and second, that the second half is nonsense as well for this reason. Whatever else Powell is after, Powell is still after power, and he's always been after power ever since he first scented the possibility of getting it. Now, that is not in itself necessarily a criticism of him, because a politician wants power for a complexity of reasons, and the first and most obvious being that he wants to do things he thinks are good for the country, and he can't do them unless he gets into power. So I don't think that is in itself a criticism of power. Powell wants power. Now, how he thinks this move will help him get it, I think it won't help him get it. I think it will reduce his chances, but I can assure you that he thinks, how I do not know, that this will ultimately, perhaps not for some time, but ultimately help his chances of power, not hinder them.
No, I didn't say he wasn't after power. What I said was that he believed, I think rightly, that there was no particular scheme of moves that would help him get it.
Well, now, let me ask you this. As you probably know, in America, Enoch Powell is primarily thought of, is primarily identified with racial exclusivism and so on. Is he primarily identified that way in England?
Not so much now, interestingly. He ran that for a long time, and I think he got as much out of it as he could, and then hasn't dropped it, but does not play it very much now. Of late, certainly in the last year or two, it's been the economics that he's been hammering at. Mm-hmm. And basically, his line has been that all forms of incomes policy, restraints, frameworks, and the rest of it are nonsense and futile nonsense, and the only thing is the totally free play of the market. That has been his line for some time.
Well, now, that's not really the kind of thing one shoots out from Colombe les deux églises, is it?
I don't think so. My own feeling is that Powell is not in fact going to come to power ever, that he shot his bolt some time ago, and we're never going to see him in any position of power. He doesn't think that.
Are there reasons to suppose that he has a national constituency strong enough to challenge the leadership of the Conservative Party, or is this only something that a man far gone in vain glory would assume?
It's very hard to say. I think he hasn't got such a constituency. He's got a constituency, quite clearly, that cuts across party boundaries. There can be no doubt of that. But I do not think that it's strong enough for him to do that. Strong enough, for instance, which would be one possibility, to simply found a new party and run for office with it. I think if he did that, he'd come a cropper, and I suspect he knows that.
Yes, if I understand the hypothesis of the question, I think is again unsound. You can't found a new party in this country. At least to do so would be such an extraordinary innovation that this isn't going to happen.
Is Mr. Treverne doing that?
Dick Treverne, no. He's being a little nuisance on the side again. But you can't, what you were suggesting, I think, challenge the Conservative leadership from a constituency in the country. Mr. Heath and his friends have so rigged the election of the Conservative leadership that it's now wholly in the hands of the county MPs. And Conservatives in the country have no say in this. What Powell hasn't is any real parliamentary constituency, though he has more than he used to, but no significant one. What he has is an enormous national constituency, but it's very difficult to turn this into political energy.
I see. So it would require, I take it, the collapse of Heath.
Oh, yes.
It would require a lot more than that. That's necessary but not sufficient.
Right. Powell is not the number two man now, in any sense of the word. So therefore, simply, it remains an inscrutable decision of his.
To me.
We have here Mr. Vincent Brown from the Evening Herald. Mr. Brown.
Well, the discussion today has been rather amazing. It seems to be exclusively concerned with how to frustrate the workers from getting more of what they earn. But I'd like to inquire from the two journalists.
Getting more?
Here.
Getting what?
More of what they earn.
That's a curious phrase.
Yeah, I was trying to understand that.
They get paid so much, but they earn more, is my point. I would just like to ask the two journalists here if they consider that a moment of revolution may have occurred in Britain for the consensus which has upheld British capitalism between workers and employers on how inflation was to be tackled, primarily through the regulation of wages. This consensus appears to have broken down, not alone in the case of the miners, but in several other cases as well. And do you think that there's any orderly process by which this consensus can be restored? Or do you think that actually there's going to be some kind of upheaval in British society?
Well, I mean, if your facts were right, I would have to answer that question. Since they're not, I don't. The fact is that up to, during, and since the struggle with the miners began, millions of workers, in many cases equally vital industries in Britain, have settled for pay increases within the statutory limits that the Pay and Prices Boards have laid down. They haven't settled happily. What worker, you, me, a miner, or anybody else, doesn't want more than he's been offered? But they have in fact settled, and they've settled, I'm sure, on the realization that the policy, though in many ways has many anomalies and is in many ways crude at the edges, is in fact both fair and necessary. The number of workers who have refused to settle with that, the miners, is very small. There may be more. So far, at any rate, there's no sign of that happening, I'm happy to say.
Yes, but the vast majority of the trade unions in Britain have opposed Phase 3, and there has been a history since the early 60s of unions refusing to go along with either Tory or Labour government's proposals for the regulation of incomes. Now, we seem to have arrived at some kind of impasse at the moment with the miners' strike. Do you think that any consensus can be worked out to rescue the situation?
But I mean, the consensus exists. The point is that nobody can ever imagine there's going to be 100% agreement in any kind of consensus situation. But at the moment, we've got very nearly 100% consensus situation, with the exception of the miners. That is what is actually happening. Of course, the unions have expressed their opposition to Phase 3, and indeed to an incomes policy in general. The unions as a whole have done that, not just the miners. But in fact, the legislation having been passed, having been enacted, the overwhelming majority have been settling within it. I think that is a very reasonable way to behave. You can oppose legislation, but once it is the law of the land, on the whole, people do in fact, and the unions do in fact, on the whole, obey it.
Odd enough, I think that's rather misleading. You asked, or didn't ask whether they were going to obey the law. You asked whether there was going to be a consensus, and I don't think there is. I'm only really relatively recently have large enough numbers of persons even been sufficiently alarmed about inflation. And I still think there's not a consensus on the genuine causes of inflation. Insofar as there is a consensus, it's probably misleading in that they do believe wage rises in themselves cause inflation. What worries me, of course, is that the government's policy, which is the only anti-inflation policy we've got, since the Labour Party has none, the government's policy is in itself highly inflationary and is predicted to produce a 15% inflation this year.
Yeah, even if the coal miners lay down with a lamb tomorrow.
Even if they lay down tomorrow, yeah.
Miss Nell McCafferty of the Irish Times.
Yes. I'd like to ask Mr. Lejeune if, as you say, the strike is going to be a long and bitter one, what likelihood, if any, is there of British Army soldiers being called in eventually to enforce the maintenance of certain safety precautions in those mines? And if they're called in, how likely is this to exacerbate the present, what must be called unrest in England, due to inflation, rising prices, disenchantment with the EEC, and the fact that miners, which none of you have mentioned so far in the programme, earn, I think it is a basic rate of £30 or $70 a week.
Well, again,
not very good wage for working on the ground.
Well, one mustn't argue about basic wages because this bears very little relation to the money they actually take home. But it's possible that troops might be used, I should think, to unload things in the docks. I can imagine that rather more than actually in the mines.
That happened in 1926.
Yes, I mean, that could happen. But basically, I think Bernard has already answered this question. I don't think that if there is a substantial Conservative win, we shall have that sort of an upheaval. And if there's a substantial Socialist win, they're going to give in to the miners and the question won't arise.
Will they not give in anyway? Will the Tories not give in? It seems likely that they're going to accept the relativity.
Yes, precisely. Well, I would agree with you that the Relativities Board is a form of giving in,
Yeah.
but in a more flagrant way. No, Heath can't afford to give in, of course. No, the Relativities Board is the excuse.
Yeah. But to get back to your, what you were saying earlier about why there's election at all, it seems perfectly obvious that whoever wins the election is going to give the miners more money, which, had they agreed to do so prior to the election, would have obviated the need for the election in the first place. So there must be another reason for holding the election apart from the miners' dispute.
Well, the fact is that that you're quite right, in a sense, to say that whoever wins the election, the miners are going to get more money. The Labour Party will give it to them then and there. The Conservative Party will presume that the Relativities Board, when set up, will give it to them then.
But less than what they asked
Certainly
for.
less than would otherwise have been the case, but still some more. That's perfectly true, but the fact remains that had the Conservatives given in straightforwardly, as it were, and simply given them an increase, broken the pay norms and given them the money, which the Labour Party will do if it wins the election, then it's quite clear there would have been no holding the dam thereafter. There is already a queue of workers sometimes in very essential industries with enormous wage claims on the table. There would have been no possibility of getting them to settle within the norm if in fact the government had given in, and there will be no possibility of getting them settled within the norm if the Labour Party wins the election and then does give in, as indeed it is pledged to do.
Yes, and one might point out that after the last miners' strike was settled by the Wilberforce report, they got, I think, 23% or more or less 23% rise. The other successful wage claims which rushed through the barrier afterwards have now reduced this differential to 5%. Exactly the same thing would happen again, so we'd be back in the same position, presumably in another year, 18 months.
Mr. Kevin Myers is the Belfast correspondent for The Observer.
I'd like to ask Mr. Lejeune, is it not true that if, in fact, the Tories win the election and the miners continue their strike, both things are probable, the strike would be ruinous for the British economy? Not terminal, perhaps, but ruinous. In which case, Phase 3 is made a nonsense of, and the original reason for not giving in to the miners' claim is also made a nonsense of.
Well, as I think both Bernard and I have said, Phase 3 was always a nonsense in one sense, but to let the whole structure collapse is immediately ruinous. I don't think, you see, that it would be the sort of absolute disastrous strike that you're envisaging. I think that once it is obvious that by persisting in this strike they can't get a Labour government, then something will be fixed up through the Relativities Board. We've already said I disprove it, but I think that's what actually
You're
happened.
suggesting that the strike is partially motivated by the desire to topple the government?
I think it's beyond doubt. I don't think anybody questions that.
Well,
that
a number
seems
of
to
people
be
would
the
question
evidence
it.
For the miners have, if their concern is to get rid of the government and have it replaced by a Labour government, surely they would have called off the miners' strike.
I don't think that logic's too simple. In fact, first of all, nobody, I think, is suggesting that the strike is solely politically motivated.
Or even primarily.
Obviously, it is also economic. They want more money. They do want more money. They're not making that up. They want more money. They also want a Labour government, if only because the Labour government has promised to give them more money. So naturally they want a Labour government. They're not crazy. I do not think it necessarily follows, however, that by going back to work, they will get a Labour government. Going back to work during the strike, they will get a Labour government.
No, but they enhance the chances of getting...
I don't think so. It could easily work the other way. The two things. First, it could easily work the other way. People could say, they could say this is just a device, a tactical trick. We won't be fooled by it. People might say that. Secondly, of course, don't forget that among the miners' leaders there is a small but very determined minority who also don't want a Labour government because their long-term strategy entails the election of a Conservative government and greater chance for economic disruption thereafter.
Marcusian approach.
if you like.
Yeah, these people actually are the whole.
I don't think that's
issue
the
of that.
dominant feeling in the miners' leadership, but it is there. There are a proportion who undoubtedly hold that.
To make an issue of that, there are about 4 members of the Communist Party on the miners' executive, and something like 19 of them voted for the continuance of the strike. This was a week ago.
Well, I mean, as Bernard says, it's perfectly possible to take two views about the advantage of this situation. The train drivers, as you know, have just suspended, as they put it, their work to rule because they think it will help the Labour Party to win the election. This is not a matter of speculation. It's the reason they've given for calling it off.
Yeah.
That's one
They
perfectly
may
legitimate
prove
view.
wrong. They may
Yes,
prove wrong. There are arguments, very powerful arguments, tactical arguments on both sides.
I'd like to just continue this business of
Go ahead.
of the extremists, the Mr. McGahey's under the bed. I mean, do you take this genuinely? Do you think that there is some sort of Leninist conspiracy working within the realms
Well,
of...
what do you mean by
trade-
conspiracy? I mean, don't you know that there are, that communists have certain aims and do exist, or do you think
I
they're
think that's
imaginary?
acknowledged. I don't think we need to discuss that. Well, that's acknowledged, that we don't need to discuss
Well, you don't
that.
seem to acknowledge
No,
it.
what I'm not
The
acknowledging-
implication
what
of
I'm
your
not
question is you
acknowledging-
don't believe in its existence.
No, what I'm not acknowledging is that, in fact, that is the influence that has motivated the strike.
I
That is
didn't
the-
say it was, nor do I believe it was. I believe that influence
I didn't
exists
say
and has
you
helped
said
to
it was.
motivate the strike.
What I'm saying is that it's a widespread, it was widespread press reports, certainly last week, including my own newspaper, made sort of very strong suggestions that, in fact, a good deal of the motivation for this strike came from communists in order to topple the government or to cause economic unrest. I was just asking you for your opinion on that.
My feeling is that communists want to do those two things and have always wanted to do those two things, and sometimes are successful and sometimes are not. So that in any situation such as the present one, with a very seriously pursued wage claim by the miners in general, they will naturally be in the forefront of pressing that, because it's a very good method, a very good ladder, if you like, for achieving their own separate ends.
One should say that I think it's Article 2 of the Constitution of the Miners' Union commits the union to the overthrow of the capitalist system in their own book of words.
Is that not a legitimate pursuit within a democratic state?
I don't know whether it's legitimate or not. That depends on the view you take of a democratic state. It's not one I approve of.
Yes, but is it not legitimate to pursue this view?
Well, no, but it's the point, Mr. Lejeune's point is very clearly directed at showing that there are political implications, not purely economic implications. You seem to dance around according as it is convenient for you to seize on the economic or the political argument. Now, it's one thing to say that it's legitimate to try to bring down capitalism, but it's another to say that people who are dedicated to that end assert themselves only with economic ends in mind.
And of course, if you say it's legitimate political activity to have a strike in order to bring down capitalism, it must be a legitimate political activity by the government to try and break the strike.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lejeune. Thank you very much, Mr. Levin.
Thank you.
Ladies and members of the panel, thank you.
For a printed bound copy of this program, send 25 cents in coin to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's 25 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. This program was made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.